Hello, this is the last program in the Handicapped Family series, and today we're concentrating on the needs of elderly handicapped people and their families. One of the main themes which has been running through the series is the need to ease the strain on caring relatives so that the disabled person can remain at home. A great many elderly people are in residential institutions today, not because their own medical conditions demand it, but because their families are no longer able to cope. So what are the problems faced by the caring relatives? To help us answer this question, we've invited Dr. Klaus Bergman to join us. He's a consultant psychiatrist at the Maudsley Hospital in London and has made a special study of this subject. Dr. Bergman, what are the main problems faced by this age group?
Well, I think the caregiving relatives, often very elderly themselves, have to face problems under three headings: physical, psychological and emotional, and social. Now, physical problems are very real. There's the lifting and dressing of heavy and sometimes uncooperative elderly relatives. And then there are the problems of toileting. Both going to the toilet and personal hygiene are important here. And it's often not very easy to do this for someone who you've looked on as a father figure or as a mother or a person in authority. To have to treat them like a child doesn't come readily and needs some help and support when you have to do this. Then, even with fit elderly relatives, sometimes when there's mental impairment, there's the physical problem of containing quite intractable wandering and restlessness, which is an enormous physical strain. Now, on the psychological side, I think the biggest strain is that connected with mental impairment. The devastating effect, for instance, of not being recognized by your mother and father, of being treated like a stranger, sometimes being abused on this account and ordered out of the house. At first, this is like ingratitude and hatred, and it comes as a very serious upset. The other things are the defect of short-term memory, the repetition time after time of the same thing, the fact that you only told it to the older person 5 minutes ago, that you're having to say it again. These things are pretty terrible.
And the social problems?
The social problems are the loss gradually of your own network of friends, your circle of interests, and becoming an isolate and a recluse because you are looking after an older person, even though your capacities and your desires and your needs remain just as great as when they were being satisfied outside.
Thank you, Dr. Bergman. We'll be returning to this later. We've talked earlier in the series about help available from the statutory services, district nurses, social workers, home helps and so on, and these services can do a great deal to ease family strains and stresses. But in many cases, more help is needed, and the voluntary organisations have an important part to play. We looked at the work of one voluntary organisation, the Crossroads Care Attendance Scheme. Crossroads operates in several parts of the country to help the families of handicapped people of all ages. We went to see how the scheme works in Dundee, particularly in respect of its elderly clients, and to set the scene, we spoke first to the District Medical Officer, Dr. James Urquhart.
Keeping the elderly in the community requires the help of very, very many people. In Dundee, we have 28,000 elderly people. We have 100 general practitioners, we have about 100 social workers, about 60 health visitors. It would be quite impossible for these people to look after so many elderly. The health service, the local authorities, the voluntary organisations have all got a most important part to play, and no one of them can really work independently. The really important thing is to ensure that they have an adequate quality of life. And the old schemes of getting the handicapped, particularly the elderly handicapped, out of the way into institutions, into hospitals, into residential homes is something that can only be stopped, and it must be stopped, if all the organisations are working together. And a most important part of this is the voluntary organisations, which Crossroads is a very important part.
Ethel Sanders works for the Dundee Crossroads Care Attendance Scheme. Under the scheme, hourly paid care attendants work to relieve the stresses and strains on families who are looking after a disabled person at home. Crossroads is a voluntary organisation which is financed in Dundee partly by private donations, partly by the Scottish office and partly by the local social work department. The care attendants do not have any specialised qualifications and work closely with the local statutory services. Mr. Thompson is one of the scheme's clients. His wife is blind and diabetic and cannot be left alone. Once a week, someone from Crossroads calls to sit with Mrs. Thompson while her husband goes out for the afternoon.
Go and have a seat.
Okay. Morning, Mrs. Thompson.
Good morning,
It's me,
dear.
it's Ethel.
That's fine.
How are you feeling?
Oh, not too bad
Very
this
good.
morning, yes.
It'll soon be your holiday. Eh?
Yes,
It'll be long now.
well, we're going down to...
The scheme is run by a voluntary management committee. The chairman is a senior lecturer at Dundee University, Rona Morrison.
Our management committee is quite small. We have on it representatives of all the major services concerned with the disabled, the social work department of the local authority, the community health department of the National Health Service, health visitor, occupational therapist, and several people who are active in other voluntary services for the disabled, and we have a banker and a lawyer. About 10 of us altogether. The job of the committee is twofold. To begin with, we have to look after the general health of the scheme and its future, which means that we have to get in funds. Not only the quite large sums that we get from public bodies, but also private gifts and donations. And also, which is rather nice in Dundee, money that's given to us by people who raise it for us. The disabled themselves in Dundee, really without being asked to, have done things to make money for us, and that's been very encouraging. So that's one of our functions. The other one is to appoint the coordinator.
And the coordinator responsible for the day-to-day running of the scheme is a housewife who lives in Moniki, just outside Dundee, Joy Malcolm.
Before appointing the attendants, we had to make sure that there was a need in Dundee and how we were going to fulfil this, rather than having care attendants appointed and no work for them to do. So I went around all the hospitals and spoke to the social work departments. I went to the social work areas and spoke there and told them just what we were hoping to do for the disabled, so that there would be a great relationship between the social workers, occupational therapists and nurses. And this would link up when Crossroads eventually came into being. Once we had established this link and everyone seemed pleased that there would be a Crossroads scheme, that we would fill a gap which was obvious to everyone concerned, then we put an advert in the paper. We had 70 phone calls and eventually we appointed 7 care attendants, 6 ladies and 1 gentleman. Obviously, caring for people in their own homes, it has to be a very flexible job. You can't say to someone, you must work 9 till 5, because the need is there perhaps for somebody at 11 o'clock at night or 6 in the morning. This was all explained to the care attendants, and they gave me times when they would be willing to work. Now, I never ever say to them, go and do this job. I always phone them and I say, I think you would be the correct person for this particular job. Could you do it? The care attendants like this way because they feel they're never coerced into doing something they feel they wouldn't be able to do, or they wouldn't have the time, or it would spoil their family relationship at home. Hello Winnie, it's Joy here. I've just had Mrs. Burry, the health visitor, on the phone asking if we can possibly do Mr. and Mrs. Muirhead again in October. Their home health's going on holiday and there's nobody to get Mr. Muirhead up and dressed. And as you did him before, I would like you to go back because they've got used to you, and she was awfully pleased the last time she phoned up. Hang on a minute then, Winnie, and I'll write that down. What was that, Monday, Thursday and Friday?
Most of the scheme's clients are referred by the statutory services. So how does Crossroads relate, for example, to the local social work department? We spoke to the Deputy Director in charge of social work in the Dundee district, Jack Rogers.
Well, the scheme as it operates just now, we have a good relationship with the local authority, and I say that not as a member of the local authority, but as a member of the Crossroads team, because I sit as the vice chairman of the Crossroads care attendant scheme in Dundee, not as the deputy director of social work in the Dundee division, but as an individual. taken that on as a personal situation. However, we do have this relationship with the local authority which allows us to carry on working as their agent in this situation. And we are hopeful, of course, that we will be allowed to continue to do so. There is no interference from the local authority. We refer cases to the coordinator, and she takes them on or doesn't take them on, as the case may be, according to the criteria that she adopts in allocating the money that's available to her for payment to the care attendants.
We found the biggest gap was where the carer couldn't get out at all. There's a great many people where they're in for weeks on end looking after this disabled person who must not be left alone.
I'm going away now. Cheerio. And see you enjoy yourself all afternoon. Right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
We find that to give them a break is marvellous. They come back refreshed. Also, the disabled person has a new friend. Nobody in a statue uniform, just an ordinary person who cares about them and who they can relate to very well.
If the caring relatives cannot get out to do their shopping, to get out to have an occasional relaxation, there becomes more and more increasing strains, and the elderly person eventually has to be moved to hospital or to a residential home just because of a breakdown of the family.
Winnie Malloy is another care attendant. Her client, Mrs. Henderson, lives with her daughter Martha. Martha has a full-time job, and when her mother was taken seriously ill, this posed a serious problem, as Martha describes.
Yes, it's about a year ago just now when Mother took her stroke. She was in hospital for a few weeks, and then she was going to be sent home. At that time, I just didn't know how I was going to cope with a full-time job and look after Mother at the same time. And as far as I could see, the hospital didn't have any sort of solution to this problem, but they directed me to the social service lady who was there. And after a few days, fortunately, I had holidays and days due me, and Mrs. Malcolm arrived one afternoon, and she introduced herself and told me the first ever I'd heard about this crossroads. I don't think I was here the first year when he arrived, and Mother, she wasn't very happy about meeting a strange person, but when I came home in the evening, she was just delighted. And then a few days after that, I met this Winnie. Now, I just call Winnie our angel, because that's what she is to us.
As the referrals started to flow in, we decided we just would not have enough money to meet all this need. It would be a great pity to have to turn people down, because every case really seemed to need help. And why should we have to turn them down if we could possibly help them? So we started on fundraising. We help 45 families at present, but we have at least 20 on the waiting list. Now, the money that we receive from the statutory bodies only covers 100 hours per week, per year. We have raised enough to cover another 10 hours per week. Because we can't raise money and just give a little help, we've got to look at it on a yearly basis. So any money we raise, we divide it up so that we can allot it per week for the year. We can give 110 hours care per week for a year at the moment, but with these 20 families, we're hoping that we may raise more in the future to cover them and to being able to give as much help as is needed in Dundee.
Another client, Mrs. Cogan, has severe arthritis of the hips and spine. After spending 15 years in bed, she has now been supplied with an adjustable day bed, which enables her to see out of the window for the first time for many years. Mrs. Cogan's a widow and lives alone, though her brother, who lives nearby, drops in to see her frequently. The district nurse gets her up in the morning, but before Crossroads there were problems about putting her back to bed in the evening.
I wasn't waiting on the nurse coming in the home help.
The nurse got me up in the morning. Well, she was quite willing to come in the afternoon, but she had a doctor's surgery, which didn't stop till 5:30. Well, by that time, that was her time up. So it was a bit of a worry, wondering how she could get to me.
as Crossroads is very flexible, we decided that in the winter she would go to bed at 3 o'clock. She was very happy at this because it started getting dark. She could no longer look out of the window. In the summer, she would like 5 o'clock, and this is what we've done for Mrs. Cogan.
There, Anna.
And how's your hip today? Is it still very stiff? Is it
I'm
when you
stiff
start walking?
I
Yeah.
know.
There you are. Now you get started, and I'll pick up all your bits and pieces and follow behind you. You don't want this towel through, do you?
Keeping the elderly person in the community as long as possible should be, with all the services working together, a planned programme. What tends to happen if you haven't got the adequate community support is that it suddenly becomes a crisis. And there's not an available bed in residential home, so the elderly person has got to be admitted into an acute bed. One can talk about the cost of an acute hospital bed being, in this district, £300 a week. A long stay bed will be probably £100 a week. And they're the wrong place for the elderly to be, because in that sort of hospital bed, an expensive bed, the staff are all geared to taking emergencies through an urgent treatment, not looking after an elderly person.
I think the future is getting to a stage now where we will finish the scheme ostensibly in June of 1980. Now, we are hopeful that, of course, that we will have proved that our existence is worthwhile in the community and that we are making a contribution to the handicapped in the community, which is not being made by anybody else. And consequently, we hope that the local authority will, at the end of the 3-year period, implement their promise that when the pilot scheme does finish, that they would ensure that people receiving help continue to receive help. And I'm hopeful that if they are prepared to do that, they will be prepared to fund it and allow the scheme to continue and also possibly increase the contribution that they are making.
And it is very important that we have Crossroads to assist the health services. They have just applied for help from the Health Board, and I have every confidence that next year some support will be forthcoming to keep them going and to allow them to increase, because this is the important thing, that the demand is insatiable for this type of help. And I think from the point of view of health service economics, it makes good economics to put a limited money into this with benefits which far outweigh the actual amount of money spent.
With Crossroads coming, it's made my life worth living. Before that, I was just in existence.
There are 19 Crossroads schemes at the moment, and more are being planned. Dr. Bergman, one point that emerges from the film is the need to prevent a problem becoming a crisis. How does one do this?
Well, I think the position, the isolated position of old Mr. Thompson in the film highlights certainly one of the most important aspects. Mr. Thompson and others like him are isolated caregivers. They feel alone, cut off, and the sense of strain of the kind of care that they have to give rises and rises. Also, the extra effort they have to put in increases. But there comes a time when the strain outweighs any increase of effort and there's a breakdown. People in hospitals and social services see this as rejection by the relative, but the relative sees this as a time of absolute breakdown. Now, the need is for early intervention before this kind of thing can happen. And early intervention can take place on several dimensions. First of all, again, as the film showed, is the need for relief within the home, the permission and the ability to go out safely, to do your shopping without rushing, to lead some social life, to pick up your contacts. The other form of relief, not shown in the film, is the provision of a day centre where the elderly person leads a social life of their own, but again the relative gets relief. Now, this is very important, but the next important thing is perhaps not so easy to show on a film, is the explanation by various professionals, doctors, social workers and nurses, of the nature of the problems that people have to face. The explanation of how to cope with certain physical problems to do with toileting and bathing, the explanation of why certain things might be frightening or upsetting, seeing blood or some secretions that are not well understood, the explanation of disturbed behaviour. For instance, I mentioned this failure of recognition that can be so upsetting. Now, many relatives interpret this as being that the older person just doesn't love them anymore, rejects them. Now, when it's explained that this is a physical disability, like other physical disabilities, that it's due to the brain not functioning, and that other disabilities are not just wicked or being teasing by the older person, teasing their relative, but are genuine disabilities, and also sometimes how to get round these. For instance, when people don't understand words, how to do miming, how to use sign language, how to suggest alternatives so that communication is improved. These are some of the psychological ways of getting through the barriers which so often affect impaired elderly people. Now, lastly, and I think most important in many ways, is to treat the older person for the treatable disabilities they've got. Now, this sounds an incredible thing to say, but in fact, people who are severely disabled, severely impaired, both mentally and physically, are sometimes assumed to be incurable with regard to every problem that they've got. But often there's pain that can be relieved, symptoms that can be made a lot better, anemias can be treated, urinary tract infections can be helped, and on the psychological side, the problem of depression, often present even with severe mental impairment, is ignored, and an eminently treatable piece of suffering for the elderly person, and hence for their relatives, is overlooked, because often elderly people who are depressed are slumped down in a stupor, and the relatives get no stimulation and no feedback from them, and treatment can help to bring them back into touch and rewarding their younger relatives with companionship and a smile occasionally.
So early intervention is very important.
Yes, I think that from the relative's point of view, it should be said that if you feel that you're going to need help, try and get it early rather than having this traditional British stiff upper lip that waits up to the point of breakdown and crisis.
Thank you, Dr. Bergman.
Thank you.
If you'd like some more details on the things we've talked about today, we've prepared a leaflet giving information about Crossroads and listing some other helpful organisations concerned with elderly people. To obtain a copy, please send a large stamped addressed envelope to this address: The Handicapped Family, BBC Television, London W12 8QT. The Handicapped Family, BBC Television, London W12 8QT. Don't forget to send a large stamped address envelope, and please write "the elderly" on it. Well, I'm afraid this brings us to the end of the series. We're hoping to make more programs of interest to handicapped people and their families in the future. Meanwhile, I hope you found these programs helpful. Goodbye.